Hello, everybody, and welcome to our fifth episode of The Liberal Arts Can Save the World. This is a show where we talk to PLU faculty and staff about the things they're passionate about and how those things matter. My name is Kevin O'Brien. I'm the Dean of Humanities. I use he, him pronouns. Today, I am really excited to be joined by a co-host who is also named Kevin. Kevin Andrew is the co-director of Alumni and Student Relations. And Kevin is also the host of another great YouTube show, Alumni Perspectives of the 21st Century, that you can watch on this very channel. Thanks so much for being here, Kevin.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
So our tradition is to ask the co-host a liberal artsy question. So my question for you is, when you're talking with PLU students and PLU alums about their career trajectory, how does the liberal arts character of PLU shape those conversations or change those conversations? Like, how does it come in?
It's so important. And so all of my team in Alumni and Student Connections, when we're doing career advising or internship advising or talking about anything related to that and preparing students while they're in school and getting them ready for after they graduate, it is really important that all PLU students emphasize their liberal arts and science education. And we talk a lot about whether it's in an interview or on your resume or in just calling a mentor and having that connection and really promoting that. And what I try to tell students is that in 2018, the Association of American Colleges and Universities, they did a massive survey of employers all over the United States. And one of the questions was about a liberal arts education and employment. And these employers overwhelmingly, by 80%, said, and I'm just going to read it directly, that regardless of their major, all college students should acquire broad knowledge in the liberal arts and sciences. That's 80% of employers, all different industries, big, small, whatever the case is. Mm-hmm. And really what employers emphasize a lot in this education is that students learn to think critically, communicate clearly, and solve complex problems. They also, at PLU, we're lucky that they're also looking at ethical issues and intercultural skills and the idea of applying your knowledge in real world settings, whether that's an internship, an apprenticeship, or research that you're doing as a science student. And so all of these things are so important. And I really want all PLU students to really proclaim that, own it, promote it, that you go to an amazing liberal arts and science university and that you have gained these skills, which I really believe will put them in a better position when they're going into their internship, whether they're going into their future career.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks, Kevin. That's awesome. Great range of ways that this is relevant. And I love the 80% statistic. And I want to give a stern talking to the other 20%, but that's for another day. But just this idea that it is genuinely useful to one's own career to have this liberal arts education is super helpful. And then hopefully we can also, I think by the end of our discussion today, we'll think about how it's also useful as a citizen and useful as a neighbor and useful as a person, but that all these things come together and the liberal arts is about all of them is super exciting. So thanks. Awesome.
You're welcome.
And our guest and our expert today is Professor Michelle Ceynar, who's a professor of psychology. Michelle has also just completed a record-breaking 3-year term as the chair of PLU's faculty, which is an amazing and tough job that she did incredibly well. Thanks so much for being here, Michelle.
Thanks for having me. This is exciting.
It's exciting to have you with us. And to start with, we want to just get a sense of your expertise. So you are a social psychologist, and that's what you study and what you teach. But if you had to explain to somebody what social psychology is in like a sentence or two, what would you say?
Well, social psychology is the study of people in their interactions with others. So we're interested in how people interact with the real or imagined presence of other people. So how we think about ourselves and how we interact with others in groups is affected by what we think others are going to think about us.
Interesting. So it's about my reaction to other people, but maybe even more so what I think other people are thinking and doing. And so
Exactly.
what's in my head? Oh wow. Oh, neat. Very cool.
Yeah.
So, so one of your to get to the liberal arts helping to save the world and being part of a contemporary conversation, one of your expertise is in gender and psychology, and you teach courses on gender and psychology. And so, we thought we would talk today about, in particular, women in politics. And we are recording this on the 12th of August. It happens to be the day after it was announced that Senator Kamala Harris will be the vice presidential nominee for the Democratic Party. This is historic in all sorts of ways. She's the first Black woman. She's the first South Asian American woman to be nominated as vice president. But it is also worth noting that she is only the third woman to be nominated as vice president by any major party in our nation's history. So lots to talk about, but maybe to at least start with a focus on gender. Michelle, as a social psychologist, like when you hear this news and when you watch people react to it, and I guess when you watch people react to the imagined reactions of others, like what are you seeing? What do you see in the way we're talking about this or not talking about this or thinking about this?
Well, my first reaction when we were talking about this at dinner last night was, let the sexism begin.
Yeah.
We've seen it before, and it keeps happening over and over again. And as I was thinking about doing this show this afternoon, I was going back to my own experience as an undergrad. And in the fall of 1988, I was in Kearney, Nebraska for my freshman year in college. And that was an election year. And we had just seen Gary Hart and that whole scandal. And then Pat Schroeder, who was a representative from Colorado, I'm from Colorado originally, had very briefly run for president herself. Mm-hmm. And she had quit her campaign, and she started crying when she quit. And there was this huge scandal, how dare she cry? And of course, women can never be leaders because they're so emotional, and they just couldn't handle the stress. Even though you had seen all kinds of examples, and we have ever since, of men who also express emotion in varied ways. But I remember as a 18-year-old out of my house for the first time, commenting on that in a class that, what's the big deal that she cries? Doesn't that show that she cares? Probably one of my very first awakenings to myself as a feminist, and looking at how women are treated differently than men. So I was thinking about Pat Schroeder a lot, as I did when Sarah Palin was nominated, and certainly during Hillary Clinton's campaign, that there have been women who have run and then been run into the ground as a result.
Yeah. And I guess I think one of my biggest questions is to ask you what how much of that do we I guess one of my temptations as a man is to say, oh, gender doesn't matter, right? I don't think about gender. I just want the best leader. But of course, Sarah Palin, Kamala Harris, they don't get to enter the world as just people without gender. We all see them through gender. And so I guess I'm curious, like, thinking about this psychologically, how much should I try not to think about gender in order not to be biased? And how much should I really try and notice, oh, someone's being treated differently because of their gender, in order not to be biased? Like, what does that question make sense about sort of how do I balance noticing and not noticing?
It does. And I would say that you should probably lean on the side of noticing.
Okay.
That we often see that the things that people respond to from women are different. They respond to female candidates differently than they do a male candidate who does the exact same thing. And so crying is one example. We see tears from men, and we're like, oh, they care, or they're upset about this issue. But when a woman cries, then she's too emotional and she can't handle it. And so if you don't notice gender, you don't see that distinction. One of the criticisms that's being bantered about for Kamala Harris is that she's too ambitious.
Right.
I've never heard a male politician being called too ambitious. I don't know
Yeah.
what that means. I mean,
Right.
Joe Biden is terribly ambitious, but that's not a
Absolutely. Right.
bad
Yeah.
thing in a man, but
Uh-huh.
we see it as a bad thing for some
Uh-huh.
odd reason for a woman.
Yeah.
So I think if you just try and pretend like gender doesn't exist, you don't see that difference, and you don't see that the criticism is gendered and not a valid criticism.
Mm-hmm.
Michelle, in this really unique time with a pandemic, social injustice, and layer all the other things that, do you think there can be a shift? I mean, that maybe it will not just be this, that, I don't know, I guess I'm trying to be on the hopeful side, that maybe there can be a little difference than Geraldine Ferraro and Sarah Palin and Hillary Clinton because of this time.
I want to be hopeful. It's the only way I can get any sleep at night. that because we have this pandemic is part of the reason why we're seeing so much activism for social justice, broadly speaking. That I think that people are able to see that this is not how the world should be, and some of these issues are coming to light because we have the time to think about them, because what else are you going to do? Just sit around the house. So I'm hopeful that there's a lot of light being shown on some of these issues, and that might help a little bit in how Harris is treated in comparison to her predecessors.
I'm thrilled that you're both at hope. This is exciting. I mean, even if you're dragging yourself there, like, hope is great. That's awesome. In the context though of the pandemic, of the movement for Black Lives, of so much going on, I guess another question that I'm curious about is, clearly gender matters so much in the way we see people, in the way we relate to politicians, in the way they relate to each other. But so does race, so does identity, so does immigration, right? So many things. And so I guess I'm curious, this is sort of back in the spirit of what should I notice and how should I practice? Like, I suspect like things like Kamala Harris is too ambitious, right? There's a gendered component to that. There's also a racial component to that. And there's the fact that she's the child of immigrants, right? And so how do we parse all the biases and all the sort of social structures that are playing a role in how these people get seen? Like, how much, and I mean, I think the worst way to do this would to say, oh no, it's important she's a woman. No, it's important she's Black. It's one or the other. And it clearly isn't that. But I'm curious, kind of, how can we keep our eye on all the things that are going on in a political debate when questions of identity come up?
I think you can't necessarily parse them apart. You have to think intersectionality. That if that we treat Kamala Harris differently because of the intersection of her identities, that the criticisms that she's too ambitious and too aggressive are very much both gendered and racial criticisms. That, when with Sarah Palin, for example, she was sexualized a lot, and the criticisms of her were very, very gendered. But I think that because there's that intersection of race and gender now, I think that you can't separate them. I think that a Black man running as vice president would be accused of some of the same things. I think a white woman running for vice president would be accused of some of the same things. But because she has both of those identities, we're going to see a little bit of everything. And all we can do is say that because of who she is, she's being treated differently than other people that would be in the same situation.
My next question is an attempt to be not politically neutral, but politically open, because and I think, having the example of Sarah Palin and Kamala Harris might be really useful here. I suspect there are people watching who want to disagree politically with Kamala Harris and what she stands for. And if there aren't any of those, I'm sure there are some who still want to disagree with things they remember Sarah Palin saying. And I guess I'm curious, what if there's any insight you can offer in what it is to be constructive and avoid sexism as much as possible, avoid racism as much as possible, but still be able to disagree, still be able to have a discourse, have a debate. If you were here, I'll put it the hardest way I can for you, Michelle. You're Mike Pence's prep person. Like you're getting him ready for his debate. Or maybe you're Joe Biden's prep person and you're getting Sarah Palin ready for her debate. You can be either one you want. What advice do you give to say, yes, like go after and say your ideas are better, but don't do it in a sexist way? Like how do we manage that? How do we manage that kind of disagreement?
I would say data. I'm a social psychologist.
Mm-hmm.
And all of us like to have data. And so I would say, if you don't have data to back up what you're saying, then you need to consider whether what you're saying is some sort of a bias.
Mm-hmm.
That if you can't define what it means to be too aggressive, or you can't define what it means to be too emotional, in a way that you can use the data to show that this particular person, loses it every time there's an issue, then you don't have ground to stand on.
Right.
But I think with any good debate, you have evidence for why you're opposing somebody's point of view. So certainly there are things to criticize Harris about. There are things to criticize Biden about, and everybody else. Show me the evidence as to why I should be concerned, and weigh that evidence for what it means.
That seems like a radical idea for our political system, Michelle. I don't know.
There's that optimism again.
Yeah, feet back on the ground. Come on. No, what I like about that is it, and I apologize, I forget the name of the representative from Colorado who ran for president that you mentioned. What was her name?
Pat Schroeder.
Pat Schroeder. I mean, the example of Pat Schroeder and the example of, oh Lord, she cried, she's too emotional, right, is such a subjective and sort of reactive response, rather than I want a politician who doesn't cry because X, Y, Z, which I don't think anybody could really articulate that. So just the idea that we should think about not just how does this feel to me immediately, like, oh, a woman cried, I feel uncomfortable, so I'm going to push that away. But like, what are my actual standards? I want a vice president who can do X, Y, and Z. Does this person exemplify X, Y, and Z? Is a much better way of sort of setting the standard and then looking at the person, rather than just getting a sort of an instinctual reaction or a dataless a reaction without evidence. That's really helpful. Yeah, thanks.
And I think that's something that we can all do, is that we're going to have immediate reactions to every political candidate. And before you start criticizing and creating memes on whatever social media you're on, pause for a minute and ask yourself why. Does this bother me because there's some valid reason why this would be detrimental to the country? Or is it just that it feels uncomfortable because I've never seen a person that looks like this in this sort of a position before? So I think we all just need to take a step back and think about why we're reacting the way that we're reacting.
And I think sorting out all this information also, and however you personally choose to filter, but I also think that links to that also, that is super important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but that's part of the challenge, right? It can feel really overwhelming, and it is tempting to go with my first impression, or to go with what the people that I tend to follow on social media are telling me is true, rather than sorting through all the information myself. But that's when I fall back, of course, on my liberal arts and sciences education that, as Kevin mentioned, is so valuable and important. Yeah.
Critical thinking.
Critical thinking. Michelle, I'm going to ask you a question about women in politics, but before I ask you that, I want to note you wrote an article about women in teaching, that the main title of which was "Dancing Backwards and in High Heels," right?
Yes.
And I want to ask you to maybe summarize like your argument there about teaching, but also just in case some of our listeners don't get the reference, like what's the dancing backwards in high heels, and what did that tell you? Why was that a good title for thinking about women in the professoriate?
Well, the quote is that Ginger Rogers had to do everything that Fred Astaire did, only backwards and in high heels. And that quote is often attributed to Ann Richards, who was governor of Texas. And so very apt for politics.
Yeah.
And the idea is that women do the same things that men do in politics or in teaching, but they have some extra challenges and extra burdens that they have to carry. So with my article and teaching, it had to do with student demands on professors, and that they expect their female professors to be more available and to give them more time to do things, and to, you know, just give them a little more grace. And they don't expect that so much from male professors. They do a little bit more. They dance backwards in high heels in order to get the same level of praise from students or to be seen as good professors. And it's the same with women in politics, that they have to be competent, but women also have to be likable. And, you know, a male politician who's angry and gruff and rude can get away with a whole lot of things. But if a woman does the same things, then she's seen as unlikable and therefore not a good politician. So she has to accomplish all that men do, only she has this extra layer of having to do it nicely, but not too nice. And she has to be competent, but not too competent. And she has to be ambitious, but not too ambitious. And so there's always this extra layer that women are struggling with. And that works with bosses and politicians and pretty much any woman that we see in a leadership role.
And I guess another place where I'm asking for guidance is, I think there is that is an injustice, right? And I want to work towards a society where it's not harder to be a woman professor or a woman politician than it is to be a man, right? It should be ideally the same for all of us. But it also kind of tempts me to look at a woman who's risen to the rank of full professor, or look at a woman who's nominated for vice president and be like, wow, that must be a really tough, strong person. But is there a danger in that we start creating a stereotype or thinking like, well, then she can really handle her, like she can take it, so we don't need to fix the system? How do we give people credit for having to work their way through the system without maybe justifying the system or expecting unreasonable things of people?
That's a really good question. I think, again, being aware that women that are in these positions and have had to fight to get there really had to do so much more than a man in a similar situation. And this also for, you know, men of color, the same sort of thing. Anybody from a non-white male group, I think. That once they're there, that's not how it should be, and that they shouldn't have to work so hard to maintain that position or to justify their having gotten there. And to maybe take a look at some of the men in similar positions and ask, are they justified in being there themselves?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a good answer. What strikes me is how much what you and social psychology through you is steering us to do is like stop and think and ask questions before just like jumping to conclusions. Is that, yeah. What a neat trick.
Right.
Wouldn't it be a good idea if we all tried that?
And isn't that what a liberal arts education in general is trying to do?
Oh, we're back. Yes, right.
And how it aligns with humanity.
Absolutely, yes.
Absolutely.
So my one last question before the fake question at the end, where we say that social psychology is great, is the theme for the YouTube channel for this week is preparing for fall, and some of the other channels are thinking about like preparing to come back to school and preparing for classes and things. But I guess I really wanted to ask, like, it's going to be a political season that's going to be brutal and divisive, best case scenario. And so I guess I'm curious, and this is a question for either of you, like, how would you recommend that folks prepare themselves to be engaged citizens, to be thoughtful, to vote, use the vote if they've got it, or to be part of the political process in any way they can, but also take care of themselves? Like, what recommendations do you have to prepare for that part of the fall?
I think preparing to vote or be part of the political process means reading broadly. Don't just read what comes into your own little bubble, which tends to be biased one way or another. But to look for sources that maybe you wouldn't normally look for, and see what people are saying. And don't assume that because everybody that you talk to likes your candidate, that there aren't just as many people out there that don't. And to be aware of what's being said so that you can have valid arguments in favor of your own candidate. How you not go crazy doing that is a whole other area of psychology that I'm not.
You mentioned the hope helping you sleep, and that seemed part of it, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that you do need to take breaks from it. You can't constantly be reading things that are making you angry, and expect to function, in a way that's manageable. I think you can, step in and out as necessary. And it's okay to not be constantly on or constantly listening to news 24 hours of the day.
Yeah.
That the best self-care is taking time to do things that just bring you joy.
Yeah, that's great. That's awesome. And again, I feel like there's this theme of be deliberate and be thoughtful, right? And being an engaged citizen doesn't mean being engaged 24 hours a day, because you can't maintain that. You can't possibly sustain it. You have to do the other things in your life as well.
Right.
Yeah. Thanks.
Sure.
So Kevin, like I said, my last question, everybody's really going to be on pins and needles, is what do you think? Can social psychology help save the world? What do you think?
I totally think it can.
Me too.
I've learned so much from Michelle today. This has been amazing.
Yeah.
And especially the comments of giving yourself space to step away from thinking about this, but also I think it's so important to engage in some way, and especially hopefully you are engaged by going and filling out your ballot and voting, because it's so important to show how many voices in America are participating. And I think that's really important, not only for us as a country, but also we show the world that as a democracy, we really believe in the power of voting, and that the voices come out and are able to do it that way, whatever side that you're on. And yeah, I think this all intersects really awesome with social psychology, and it's really good.
Yeah, no, I love it. And I think what I want to add to that is that voting should be the product of evidence-based thinking. And part of evidence-based thinking is thinking about our own thinking. And I feel like that's something that's really important that you said, and that to check myself, for me as a straight, white, cisgendered male, thinking about my thinking means noticing the things that I might not be forced to think about that other people have had to throughout their lives, and thinking about what have I been allowed to not notice, and what have I been allowed to not pay attention to not worry about, and what changes when I start noticing those things, and I let people teach me about the sides of our society, the sides of our world, the sides of our politics that I might not have had to see before. So, and I feel like psychology gives us tools for thinking about our thinking, which is awesome. So thank you, Michelle.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
So it just remains for me to say again, thanks to both of you, Kevin and Michelle, for spending the time doing this. I want to thank Kenzie, who's our producer, and I want to thank Lace Smith, who is the boss, and most of all, I want to thank all the people watching this. This will be our last episode in this summer series of The Liberal Arts Can Save the World, but I hope that you keep asking these questions, and those of you who are PLU students will soon have your own direct contact with PLU professors, and I hope you take some inspiration to ask them about the things they care about, and ask them about how the things they're teaching, the things they're doing, the things they're passionate about matter in the world. And we're going to be dealing with the pandemic and the election and the semester and all sorts of things. But what gives me hope is that whenever I have these conversations with folks at PLU about what do you really care about, I find these things that make me think the world could be better, that we can make progress. And so that's super inspiring. And I hope we all continue these conversations. Thanks so much, y'all.
Thank you.